There was a time when your neighbors knew where your kids were. Before you did, they kept a spare key to your house, lent you tools, watched out for the children, and sometimes brought over dinner. Before you had a chance to ask, nobody called it building, community. They just called it a normal day. But those neighborhoods weren't close simply because people were friendlier back then. Daily life gave them dozens of small reasons to need one another. In this video, we're going back to the ordinary things that once sent neighbors to each other's doors. Because what held those neighborhoods together wasn't friendliness alone. It was something far more ordinary and much easier to lose. If you grew up in an American neighborhood a few decades ago, this scene may have been too ordinary for anyone to think of photographing it. A kid dropped his bike on the lawn, ran up the front steps, and knocked on the door. Is Tommy home? There was no calling ahead, no sending a message first. You just went over to find out. If Tommy wasn't home, his mother might say, "He's over at Billy's." So you got back on your bike and rode to Billy's house. Sometimes finding one friend meant visiting 3 houses and speaking to 3 different adults. Parents knew which houses had children the same age, which family had the dog that wasn't quite friendly, which basement had enough room for everyone when it rained, which family ate dinner at exactly 6, and which kids knew that one call from the porch meant it was time to come home. Sometimes a bicycle lying on the lawn was enough to answer the question, where are the kids? Probably at the Johnsons. Their bikes are out front. That was enough. But if you were a kid, there was something else. You learned fairly early. Your parents weren't the only people watching you. The whole neighborhood seemed to have eyes. Riding your bike too fast in the street. Somebody saw you. Climbing somewhere the adults thought was dangerous. Somebody saw that too. Throwing a ball through the neighbor's garage window. Somebody definitely saw that. You could walk home telling yourself the whole thing was over, only to step into the kitchen and hear, "I heard what you did at the Johnsons this afternoon." This was one of the great mysteries of childhood. How did news travel so quickly when the internet didn't even exist? Maybe Mrs. Johnson called your mother. Maybe they met in the driveway. Or maybe a neighborhood where people saw one another every day simply didn't need much technology to spread the news. Naturally, children didn't always appreciate this arrangement. But if you fell off your bike 3 blocks from home, the first person to help you wasn't necessarily your mother or father. Another adult might pull you up, brush the dirt from your knee, and say, "Go on home. Your mother's looking for you." Child who got into trouble away from home usually didn't have to wait until getting back there before someone helped. Most neighborhoods probably had their own Mrs. Johnson, but keeping an eye on someone else's child was only the beginning. Some neighbors were trusted with much more. The front porch did its part to look at old photographs of American neighborhoods, and you'll often see a few metal chairs, a rocking chair, a cold drink, and sometimes a small radio. Sit outside long enough and you learned who had just come home from work, who was fixing a Buick in the driveway, which family had visitors, and which child was being called to dinner for the 3rd time. While pretending not to hear, someone walking past would wave, "Hey, Bill." Bill only meant to say hello. 10 minutes later, they'd moved from the weather to baseball, from baseball to the fence, and from the fence to the fact that Frank still hadn't returned the drill. Nobody scheduled those conversations. One person happened to be sitting on the porch, and the other happened to be walking past as air conditioning, television, and indoor entertainment became more common. Families gradually spent more of their time inside. That was understandable. The living room was cooler, but there were also fewer chances to stop and talk simply because someone happened to be passing by. Then there was borrowing things. Do you have a ladder? Can I borrow your wrenches this afternoon? Do you have any extra folding chairs? We're having people over this weekend. Every house didn't need to own everything. Bob had the ladder. Frank had the good tools. The Wilsons had several folding chairs. And if 20 people were coming to your barbecue, there was a good chance that some of the chairs in your yard belonged to somebody else. Borrowing one item created at least 2 visits. 1 to pick it up. 1 to return it. If the borrower had a poor memory, there might be a third. Whatever happened to my ladder? Oh, right. Being close to your neighbors wasn't always sentimental. Sometimes it simply meant knowing exactly who still had your extension cord. Borrowing tools kept neighbors talking on ordinary days. But the real test of a neighborhood came when a family was no longer having an ordinary day. There were times when someone knocked on the door not to ask for something, but to bring something over. Someone next door was sick. A family had just brought home a new baby. Someone had died. And suddenly there was another casserole in the kitchen or a pot of soup. A pie, maybe just a plate covered with foil. Some neighbors brought food and stayed to ask how things were going. Some remained to help for a while. Others simply said, "Don't worry about dinner tonight." A few days later, the dish was washed and returned. Today, a kind message can reach someone almost instantly. It's still a way to let another person know that someone is thinking of them. But a warm Pyrex dish also meant that a neighbor had spent time preparing a meal and then carried it over personally. It wasn't a grand gesture, it was a practical way of caring for a family that was going through something. Many neighborhoods also had someone everybody consulted when something stopped working. The lawnmower wouldn't start? Asked Jim. The car was making a strange noise. Frank probably knows. The radio was acting up. The man at the end of the street has fixed a few of those. YouTube didn't exist, but nearly every neighborhood seemed to have one. Man who was completely convinced that he understood carburetors. Every now and then. He actually did. People back then weren't naturally better at fixing everything. They just knew exactly whose door to knock on. Perhaps the clearest sign of trust was something no larger than the palm of your hand. A key. Your family went away for a few days. The neighbors picked up the newspaper, watered the plants. Fed the dog, pulled in the trash cans. Maybe they checked the basement after a heavy rain. Here's the key to the back door. It was said as if it were nothing unusual. Borrowing someone's ladder was one thing. Giving another person the ability to enter your home while you were away was something else. This didn't happen everywhere, and not every family had that kind of relationship with its neighbors. But where those relationships did exist, trust could be very practical. Sometimes it was simply your house key sitting in a drawer in the kitchen next door. That sounds comforting, and often it was. But there was another side to living where everybody knew everybody. The neighbor who knew someone in your house was sick might also know whose unfamiliar car was parked outside the night before. The person who heard a child fall in the yard might also hear an argument on the other side of the fence. Being looked after also meant that very little went unnoticed. Some people remember that closeness fondly, others found it intrusive. Those neighborhoods were not perfect, but they didn't disappear simply because Americans suddenly got tired of their neighbors. The reasons to knock on the door next door gradually became fewer. A tool could be bought or rented. The car could be taken to a garage. And if you wanted to find Tommy, you could send a message. Life became faster and easier, and few of us would want to give up that convenience. Each improvement solved a real problem. It also removed one more reason to walk next door. And that may be the part nobody noticed at the time. Convenience didn't make neighbors care less. It simply gave them fewer reasons to know one. Another. Old photographs preserved the porches, the lawns, and the bicycles left out front. What they couldn't show was how many times people knocked on one another's doors during an ordinary day. Sometimes it was to find a child, sometimes it was to borrow a ladder, sometimes it was to bring over a meal because the family next door was having a difficult week. Nobody thought they were doing anything remarkable. One neighbor helped with a small problem. and another returned the favor later. That was how neighbors got to know one another. Over time, familiarity became trust, and trust sometimes became friendship. Life is far more convenient now. Most of us probably wouldn't want to return to a time when we had to visit the neighbors every time we needed a tool. But borrowing, asking, and helping were also how neighbors became more than strangers living side by side. When those small exchanges became less common, it became possible to live next to someone for years and know almost nothing about them. If you still remember a neighbor who kept your key, helped fix the car, brought over food, or simply showed up when your family needed someone, tell us about them in the comments. At the time, nobody may have thought they were doing anything special, but years later, those are often the people we remember when we think about our old neighborhoods, not simply because they lived nearby, but because when something happened, they were often among the first to come over. If you enjoy the everyday stories of American life that rarely make it into history books, stay with us here at Old America Unspoken. Thank you for watching.